Welcome, everyone. As the director said, my name is Rich Cogliano. I am the Planning Section Chief for Vermont Emergency Management. And I'm going to take some time today to talk about our long-term power outage incident annex. That's a really big, long phrase, but basically what we're planning for is what happens when there is no power in Vermont for an extended period of time, whether that period of time is 2 weeks, or up to 6 months. What do we do and how do we do that? As the name implies, this is an annex to our state's emergency management plan. So this is something that will allow us to leverage what we already have in place, but bring up some of the more interesting issues around a long-term power outage to the forefront and help us plan it. So our purpose today is to present an outline of our long-term power outage incident annex to all of you, our partners, our local emergency management directors, and get some feedback. So how we're going to do this is we're going to roll through our situation and assumptions. So what are our planning factors? What are we considering for this annex? Talk about the concept of operations, how we think it's going to play out. And then for the most of this, we're going to talk about our objectives and our strategies. So what are the things that we're hoping to achieve as objectives for this plan? And then that's when I want to get your feedback. Are we hitting the mark? Are there things we haven't considered that you all may need from us in times of a long-term power outage? So let's get right into situation and assumptions. So our major situation here, our scenario, if you will, is a vast majority of Vermont has lost power and will be out for a month or more. So there's something going on. It's catastrophic, it's regional. It's affecting not only Vermont, but some of the areas around us. So Quebec, New York, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. We are basically planning for the response phase of this. Recovery comes after, and we will be doing that planning for that throughout the response phase. And the focus of our plan isn't how do we turn the power back on? That's the utilities. Our focus is how do we mitigate the effects of that? How do we help our Vermonters that are suffering without power for a month or more? So we really broke it down into a couple of critical response stages. Phase 1 is our initial outage. That's the first couple of days. People are running on generator. Comms are still up and running. We may not know that it's going to last more than a couple of days at that point. Phase 2 is when we realize this is going to be a long-term event. And people with generators and backup batteries and even all the cell towers we rely on, their generators will start failing. That's the phase 2. And then from there, we break it into 2 branches, A and B. And we'll talk about that. So how we break it into branches. Branch A is no incoming power, meaning our power generation is offline. All our wires, everything to get the power from someplace to your house is physically there. We just can't get it there. So if you can read the tiny print on the slide, we're talking cyber attacks, a geomagnetic storm, things like that. For branch B, that's no power lines. And I'm giving this talk today, completely didn't plan it, and I apologize, but this is the scenario that Puerto Rico is under right now. We saw it with Hurricane Maria. We're now seeing it with Hurricane Fiona, where some cataclysmic weather event has come in and the transmission and distribution systems are gone. That is branch B. Other than that, we're treating this as scenario agnostic, meaning we're not planning for a cyber attack causing power outage or a Carrington event, a geomagnetic storm causing a power outage. We're planning for just the power outage. And those are the 2 things. So as I said, phase 1 is our, right here, that's the first couple of days when we have no power, but we do have generators and things online. Phase 2 is going to be the first couple of weeks. People don't have power. Utilities and generators may have some sites up and running, but most sites will not have that. So even if you have a backup generator, there might not be the fuel to run it. When we get to phase 3, that's really weeks 2 through 4. Under a branch A, which is no incoming power scenario, we're talking about key areas having power, so we're able to get some generation up and running and get it to the big areas. We may have power coming into the state, but it's not enough for the whole state, so we're doing rolling blackouts. Something like you might see in California recently with the high heat wave, and they do rolling blackouts so that there's enough power for part of the population for a couple hours a day. Under the no power line scenario, we may get some of the major facilities online, some of those transmission lines back up and running, the major thoroughfares of power, if you will, but most people still won't have power. When we get to phase 4, and that's the majority of restoration, most people are back up and running. Under that no incoming power branch, we have power coming in, and we can get most people power for most of the day, but it's still not going to be 100%. Under the no power line scenario, this is something that we typically see in like an ice storm now, where most people have power, but some of those last line customers, some of those more rural places where you actually have to rebuild some of the infrastructure, they're still not going to have power for a while. If a winter storm comes and you don't have power for a week, you're probably in this boat here as not having power under this scenario. And then phase 5 is recovery. So once we get power back up and running, how do we recover from this? As anyone who's been a part of disaster management knows, recovery takes a very long time. We don't know all the factors coming into this, so recovery will be planned for over the course of the outage. We do a great job in our state emergency management plan of laying out a recovery framework early on in the process. So what are some of our general planning assumptions? As I said, all of Vermont, as well as portions of New York, Mass, New Hampshire, and Quebec are affected. Power's out by the time it becomes apparent this is a long-term outage. So we're not going into this going, okay, we're going to be without power for 6 weeks. What do we need to do? It's power goes out, day or two later, we're going, okay, this is going to be a major event. This is going to take a long time. We need to start standing this up. We will request resources early on from the federal government and other states. But given the regionalized nature of an event like this, we may not have those resources. We may not get a ton of resources from the federal government. So other than widespread lack of power, utilities and other organizations have normal response resources. So we're not presuming that our utilities don't have their trucks and their poles. We're assuming they have all the stuff they normally have. They just don't have the power. We're also not factoring in other things like a zombie apocalypse. I'm a fan of The Walking Dead. I've seen just about all the episodes. I've been to where they filmed part of The Walking Dead, which is kind of cool. In that scenario, they had no power, but they also had other big factors like zombies. So we're not planning on that. We're not planning on World War III. We're not planning on a super volcano eruption, which if you're in for some interesting reading, in about 11,000 years, we will have a volcano under Vermont. It's actually forming. It's really cool, but it's 11,000 years from now, and I don't plan to be around that long. Some general planning assumptions. We haven't taken a ton of look at the time of year. Time of year in Vermont, as all of us know, really, it can be a challenge. If this happens in the winter, we need to provide heat to folks. But you can put your food outside and it will last longer. It may freeze. If it's summertime, you can't put food outside and your food goes bad quicker. So we got to plan for that. If it's fall, like it is now, I mean, most of us, if we have gardens, we're getting our harvest in, we're canning, we're doing things like that. Our food will be okay for a while. We'll have food. But if it's springtime and we haven't done our gardening yet, we don't really have a lot of food. So some of that takes place and we have to plan for food distribution throughout this. Generally, resources are going to be available outside of the affected area, meaning we can bring in stuff from other states and the federal government. But as I said, Vermont is small. We may not have the highest priority depending on how regional this event. If this is all of New England, Boston's going to have a much larger need for resources than Vermont. Other disasters. We were fortunate for most of COVID. We didn't have other disasters up until last summer when we had a federally declared flood in Bennington and Windham counties. So there could be other disasters. There could be looting. There could be a snowstorm or flooding or a heat wave or something going on during this. We're not really taking into account all of those different scenarios. We're planning just for the outage. State and federal regulations. It's not deer season, but if we were in a power outage right now, is someone going to come knock on your door for taking a deer out of season? Probably not. We're planning for the laws to stay in effect, but we're also realistically looking at, are there some things that can be suspended? So that's something that we are taking back and would have to go up to our leadership and the governor's level. Communications. We all have these electronic leashes, phones, things like that. They're going to work for the first couple of hours, most likely. Our cell communication networks have backup generators. They'll only last for so long. So it's going to be very critical for us and all of you to communicate in that early day of this event and let people know what the planning expectations are over the next month. And then as far as transportation, we are planning that our infrastructure is mostly up and running. Short of that catastrophic event that takes down all the transmission lines, we may have some road impacts, some obstructions, but for the most part, we're planning that transportation should be up and running within a few days if that's the case. So one of the things that we've done is we looked at FEMA Region 1. So FEMA has a great plan for long-term power outage and what the federal government can do to respond. And so we're tailoring our plan to kind of go off of what they are doing. This top graphic here is a New England view of the power utilities. So you can see most of our utilities are Green Mountain Power, because here we are, my laser, there we go. Here's Vermont, and the green is Green Mountain Power. So most of us have Green Mountain Power, but we do have other utility companies that come in. The goal of the Region 1 plan and our plan as well is to enable public and private sector utilities to recover. So we want them to do the recovery work. We're not telling them how to do it, but we are partnering with them. We want to support the survivors. So all of us that are affected by this and at our homes, we want to support you. We want to get you what you need to stay alive during this. And we want to make sure that public safety services, our critical things, are as available as we need them to be. Unfortunately, we won't have, law enforcement coming over for a noise complaint from your neighbor. We're going to be focusing on the critical life safety aspects of that. And we'll talk more about that when we get to objectives. So let's talk concept of operations. So these are the phases. We've talked about the phases. What are we trying to do during that? So phase 1 is really about us making key decisions on how to operate, issuing guidance and warnings, and start to do any coordination or preparation work. That's the first couple of days. We're realizing this is going to be a long-term event, so we got to act quickly to get the word out. For phase 2, making sure our infrastructure is up and running, focus on life safety actions across all of our lifelines. I'll talk about lifelines in just a minute. And assist the utilities in power restoration. If we need to evacuate folks for whatever reason, maybe it's from hospital to hospital because little hospital doesn't have the backup power to support like big hospital does. We may be doing things like that. But one of these things here in red, this last one, establish service and support hubs to support residents staying in place. That is a concept we're playing with, modeled off what we did a lot of times in COVID, where we were distributing food and things to folks that needed it. We'll talk about that more in a minute, but that's one of our major concepts that we are trying to put into this plan, which is how do we support people so that you can access food and communications and power within about an hour's drive of everybody in Vermont. It's not easy, but we're working on it. Phase 3, again, this is our limited restoration. Some people have power. We have little islands of power. We're going to maintain those support hubs. So wherever we have food distribution or medical hubs or whatever it is, we're going to support those. But if it's in an area that has power back completely, we'll start drawing down and moving those resources to other areas that need it. Provide services from areas with power to areas without power. And then move state activities and residents to areas with full power. So if we have shelters set up in areas with no power and we now have an area with power, maybe we can move people and resources there so they can take advantage of that. Phase 4 is the majority restoration. Again, most people have power. We're going to, again, maintain those hubs, draw them down as power comes back up, return state services back to normal as best we can, and ensure everyone's restored to a stable situation before shifting to recovery. So we want to make sure we are back up and running before we say, oh, we're better, let's go over to recovery now. And then, as I said, recovery isn't directly called out in this, but is going to be planned during an event like this. So I mentioned lifelines. One of the things that we are doing with this plan, and it's kind of a first for us, is we're organizing it by something called community lifelines. FEMA created or established the community lifelines in 2017 as a mechanism for identifying disaster impacts and tracking their stabilization efforts during a disaster. So part of our State Emergency Operations Center is the biggest section, the Mission and Resource Support section. That section is actually organized very closely to the community lifelines, and that was planned so that we have a food, water, shelter branch focusing on getting food, water, and sheltering to people. We have a safety and security branch. We have a health and medical branch. So all of those branches, when we organize a plan like this, now have tasks and objectives assigned to them. It really facilitates a much easier understanding and grasp of what this plan is, what are the priorities when we start having an incident like this. So by branches here, by community lifelines, safety and security lifeline is focused on ensuring emergency responders, life safety and security missions are provided the resources and support necessary. We want people to live. We want them to be secure as best as possible. So we're going to provide the resources that are needed. Human services to vulnerable populations, prioritize safety and security resources to state agencies. If we can split resources up, we will. Food, water, and shelter lifeline. What are our major muscle movements here? It's distribution of food and water to the public at established hubs. That's really about it. If we have no power for a month or more, food and water are going to be needed by everybody. So how do we get that to them? Maintain situational awareness on private sector supply food chain. So we have partnered and we've talked with the grocers associations. How can they move food into Vermont? What resources do they have? Where are they prioritizing their food? If the private sector is up and running in certain areas, that's great. We can shift our focus to areas that it's not up and running. The last one here, disaster housing and shelter. If it's middle of winter and there's no heat, we're going to need to house people. Where do we put them up? Same with summer and it's 100 degrees. We need to put people up. There are people that are not going to be able to stay in their living situations during a long-term power outage. So we have to plan for that. Energy focuses on establishing temporary and long-term power missions, supporting power grid restoration, and ensuring the supply chain and prioritization for fuel for critical life safety functions. Meaning critical facilities, hospitals, are getting priority for their fuel for their generators. Fuel for vehicles for emergency responders is prioritized over the general public because we need to keep those critical services up and running. Communications is going to be critical. How do we get the word out early on? And then how do we keep in touch with folks? What are the channels? Internet will probably be down. Cell will probably be down. So radio, what radio frequencies work? Where can we talk? How do we talk? How do we relay messages? Transportation, the big muscle movements here are coordinate support for keeping transportation infrastructure open. Okay, yeah, we need roads open so we can get our power restoration crews out there restoring the power. And then also identify opportunities to add transportation assets to support increased volume of commodities. Basically, how do we get the resources of food and water, whatever it is, out to people? We need those transportation resources. We need drivers. We need trucks. Let's get those. Under health and medical, I think this sums it up. Coordinate and support emergency operation of the healthcare system in Vermont to minimize health impacts. So how do we help our healthcare partners do what they can in this critical time? We saw in COVID, we canceled non-elective surgeries. I think it's a good bet we'll probably do that this time too. But what do we need to do? How do we protect our most vulnerable populations and minimize their health impacts? And then hazmat, for those of you that are emergency responders in the room, and I know there's a couple here from the hazmat team listening in, there are hazardous materials stored all over Vermont. And for the most part, they're fine. Think of your gas station. The gas is underground. It's in a tank. It's not going anywhere. If there's no power, you can't get it out of there. But what is out there that relies on power to keep a system or a process running that if there's a disruption to that power could cause a problem? What hazardous materials could be spilled or leak or somehow get out into the environment during an event like this? And what resources do we need to stage or prepare or move in this event? So that's what the hazmat group's working on. So I mentioned these service and support hubs. Hubs are a one-stop shop, an area supported of sustained power. So it could be generator power that's constantly refueled and running. It could be microgrid, which is basically small scale. You have power generation and distribution network that allows people to stay in their homes. The purpose of the hub is to enable affected population to remain in their homes during a power outage extending more than 14 days, more than 2 weeks, through areas of operations. So the big takeaway here, and this is a map we used for COVID, we just kind of overlaid it with power outage stuff, but we would have a couple of big warehouses where we would have things. We'd have sites that are open once a week. We could have sites that are open every other week to distribute food and water. Maybe they would have medical supplies and doctors. Some of the things we're considering for these. So supplies, critical supplies, hydration, hygiene, medication, medical services, public safety. You need law enforcement, you need fire or EMS, they'll be there. Support facilities. We understand that if we have these within an hour's drive of everyone, you may be able to make 1 or 2 round trips if your tank is full when this happens. But other than that, you may not be able to do that. So vehicle fuel is going to be critical. We may have to have a couple of tanker trucks there so that you can fuel your vehicle to get back home after coming to visit one of these hubs. And then finance and banking. This is going to be a major impact. I mean, if you think about just a communications disruption, you go to the gas pump and you want to put gas in your car, there's no comms, your credit card's not going to work. So finance and banking is going to be critical. We're exploring ways to keep them into these hubs. So this is one of the concepts we're considering and working on, trying to get the details sorted out. So we're thinking about 5 to 10 major hubs, again, supported by FEMA. Those are the resources coming in from out of state. And then smaller satellite hubs so we can really affect a great deal of stuff for the general population. All right. Objectives and strategies. So this is, I have given you the kind of the high level objectives that we're achieving. Now, a note on objectives. This is not going to dive into all of the details of all of the actions that need to be taken. These are high level, think in long-term power outage, we need to restore power. We're not getting into how do we do it? How do we get the grid up and running? Where do we get the employees from? We're not focused on that. This is the big objective. What do we want to accomplish? I'm going to review the objectives here. We have some strategies that fit under these. I didn't post them all here because there's actually quite a few. And we don't have enough time to do them all. So objectives and strategies. Let's roll. Phase 1, objectives. Clarify and establish common understanding of the type, extent, duration of expected power outage. So get some awareness on what are we actually trying to do. Number 2 is update inventory of potential resources and their capabilities and requirements. So what resources do we have? What buildings have generators? What critical infrastructure has generators? What are their fuel levels? Where can we get it? And how can we secure those? And then 3 is prepare systems and personnel to operate in diminished environment for extended period of time. That's a very nebulous goal, a nebulous objective. Basically, that's putting the word out that here's what's happening. We know it's going to be bad. We're going to recover from it and get back. But here's what you need to focus on and get that word out to all sectors. We're talking VT Alert, HAN, everything out to our local emergency responders, the general public, our staff, our partners, so people know what's going on and what's expected of them. That's phase 1. Let's jump into phases 2 through 4. That's the we're out for a couple of weeks, limited restoration, and mostly restored. So prioritize providing critical safety and security services, resources, and information to minimize significant risk to the greatest number of people. We want to protect people. We want to make sure people are as safe and secure as humanly possible. You'll notice here, next to all of these, we list the lifeline. So again, going back to that lifeline concept, we know what lifeline is impacted, what it's going to look like to get back to fully restored, what they need to do, and then taking that and breaking it into our State Emergency Operations Center, and we know what branch of the MARS section is working on what. Coordinate, prioritize distribution of food and water to residents. Coordinate provision of shelter for residents. Coordinate support and emergency operation of the healthcare system. I'm not getting into all the details of these, but these are our objectives. So safety, security, food and water, shelter, healthcare. This is supporting our utilities and getting the power back up and running. So coordinate support for power utilities and fuel distribution to enable emergency power generation and restoration of commercial power. So what do our utilities, our partners, our fuel dealers need to get up and running, and how can we support them? Establish clear alternate communication channels between state partners and municipalities, as well as individual problem reporting, and then maintain that. So how can we talk to people through this? How can we get good, I think what's called bi-directional communication, meaning I talk to you, you talk to me. How do we do that? And then coordinate support for phone, mobile, internet providers to maintain or reestablish normal comms. How do we get comms back up and running? Coordinate support for keeping transportation infrastructure open. Again, that's our transportation thing. If we can't move people and resources from A to B, we can't get that restored. So how do we keep that up and running? Prevent or minimize releases of hazardous materials to minimize impact on health, life safety, and future cleanup. So as I mentioned with hazmat, we know we're going to have hazardous materials releases. How do we minimize those? And if we know they're going to be particularly bad, how do we protect the population as best we can? Establish and support regional hubs. So that's that hub concept I spoke of just a few minutes ago. Let's support those. And that's going to be focused on all lifelines. We're all working on those. And then this one here, identify trunks for priority restoration to power critical infrastructure. So where do we have to focus our restoration efforts? Do we have critical infrastructure that needs priority for getting power? Thinking large hospitals, shelters that are set up, critical government resources, or maybe it's getting power reconnected to power generation facilities. What are those critical areas we need to get up and running? And that's really going to be focused on the State OC and our MAC group. That's our leadership group. Think the governor and the governor's cabinet. So now that you heard what we're trying to do, how we're trying to do it, the whole plan outline that we've come up with so far, where are we at in the planning process and what are our next steps? So this is the 6-step planning process that FEMA uses. We here in Vermont have adopted it. And it's a great way to identify and plan and make a plan. You write this out and you customize it to your timeline and your plan. So we got the overarching guidance of what are our lanes for this power outage. Is it a 2-week outage? No. This is 30 days or more affecting all of Vermont and part of the surrounding area. Okay, we have our framework. We know what we're operating under. Who's our planning team? So we have a core planning team of the planning section at Vermont Emergency Management, but we also have a large group. All of those lifelines, all of them have partner agencies, state agencies tied to them. Let's bring them in and get what they are working on. That's where our objectives came from. We asked our partners, if this is the scenario, what are you focused on? And we whittled it down and came up with those main objectives. So draft our situation, initial planning meeting, come up with our objectives, our scenario. And here we are. We have done that all summer long, worked on that. And now what's our next step? Now that we've refined those objectives, we're going to bring them back to our working groups. So we have a working group for each of those lifelines. Bring them back. Say, okay, you have your objectives. Here are the strategies we've talked about before. What strategies are we missing? What interim steps do we need to write in? Get those done. Then start working on writing the actual plan. We have a draft of it already. We've put this information in, but now we have to fill in the blanks and make it into an actual response plan. At the end of this, we're going to be briefing our director and our leadership. And we will be taking this probably by the end of the year into January. This will be done. We'll be exercising it. And our goal to work towards here is FEMA in Region 1 is holding an exercise in March focused on long-term power outage. So we have asked, and we're going to start the process of planning with them and participating in that exercise so we can actually evaluate our plan. So the goal here is get the plan written, drafted, done end of the year, do a tabletop on it in, say, January. If we need to make some improvements, make them. But then the big exercise is going to be in March. It'll be a functional exercise with our state EOC. Yeah, that's basically what I said, but you can see working groups to refine our strategies. We're going to be drafting the community lifelines. We're going to have a draft of the annex complete in December. I plan on doing more of these sessions throughout December to hear your feedback on the plan. I want to hear feedback today on what you think of our objectives. Are we targeting the right objectives? I mean, we kind of tried to look at life safety, incident stabilization, and property preservation. Those are the big 3 focus areas for us. Did we hit that? So once the plan is done and drafted, we'll do another couple of these sessions to hear your feedback on the actual plan, on the strategies, on the different parts of the plan. Based on the comments, we'll refine it, we'll exercise it, and then exercise the draft annex in February, with March being really our functional exercise. So with that, and with 8 minutes remaining, I want to hear from all of you. If you are physically here at Killington Resort for the conference, you can feel free to stop me in the hall. I'll be here the next couple of days. If you're virtual, please, I want to hear, based on the objectives you have seen, do you anticipate having any unmet needs? Are there things that we haven't planned for that you think you would need from us? What other needs will you and your citizens need from the state during this? What is the best way to communicate with you during this type of incident? We've talked about communications, and our cell phones will be down. Do you have radio? Do you have battery backup for the radio? What radio frequencies work? Do you have a spot where we could send a courier to connect with somebody? Would you stand up your local EOC so that we know where we can always send someone with a message? Pre-identification of hubs. I talked about the hub concept. Where should we have them? The map I showed was just a mock-up based off where we did food distribution in COVID. That tended to work well, but are there areas that were underserved or unmet? And then what resources does your community have? Do you have a microgrid? Do you have solar power, battery backup that you can be up and running completely independent of the grid for weeks or months? Do you have a battery bank of Tesla walls, and people in your community can come and plug their electric car in to charge your town office? What resources do you have? Do you have backup generators that can run for months or weeks at a time? So this is where I want to hear from you. What do you have? So folks that are virtual, please, put them into the chat. Let me know what you want to hear from this plan or see in this plan. All right, so first comment, if VM is activated for an emergency for an incident as such, how does VDH emergency preparedness specialist fall into this category? So that's a great question, because the EP specialists are out in the counties, essentially. They're out in the towns that are affected. So you would probably be working under the Health Operations Center. I would completely anticipate that the Health Operations Center is up and running during this, as is the State Emergency Operations Center. This part of this whole power outage planning is we won't be able to be virtual like we have been for the last few years. So we're going to physically need butts and seats in Waterbury. I imagine the health department would need that in Burlington as well. Or maybe in Waterbury, we'd co-locate or something because comms is down. Will state develop a list of suggested trainings they want local towns EMDs to engage in? So that's a great one. There's resources out there for planning for long-term power outages. I don't know what sort of trainings there are. But if we can find some that are good and easy to access, then great. Yeah, so Stephanie, you hit a great point here. Do you have any thought, don't have thoughts, but want to piggyback on the state's process to develop municipal LEMP annex? So this is where I want to go. We're developing a state annex. I want to get it evaluated. I want to get it updated. I want to get it workable. And then I want to take it and distill it down and provide a template for all of you and your communities to put into your LEMP, your local emergency management plan. What are the things that you need? Start planning for what resources you have, what your critical infrastructure is, what your generation capabilities are like, what local resources you can leverage. I'd love to see that as a local annex, and I'd love to take what we have and distill it down. We may be a year or so out on that, but it's something that's coming, and that's where, as planning section chief, I oversee the state emergency management plan. I would love to take the annexes we develop and the things we develop and distill them down and make templates for local municipalities so the plans all talk and work together. Okay. Are there plans in place to support financial sector? Example, making sure ATMs and their behind the scenes support systems are up so folks can get cash to buy gas. Honestly, that's something we're working on, but we're probably going to have to operate under the presumption that that's all down. People may have money in the bank they just can't get to. And that's one of the reasons we're focusing on food and water distribution and gasoline distribution and things like that, and prioritizing those things so that we can just get stuff to people. We'll worry about the cost of that later because this is a disaster. Okay. How are communication plans, or how specific are communication plans, mode pathway with healthcare partners? Sarah, that's something we got to work on. Early on, when we all have power, we're going to be pushing out messages as best we can, and we're going to rely on folks like you at VDH to help share the message. But once we're in this, how do we communicate? We do have, and we're undertaking an assessment right now. A lot of our hospitals and district offices throughout the state have RACES communications capability, amateur radio communications. That may be the best way to go. They rely on power, but if we can get hospitals up and running and we have the state EOC up and running and we're all on generator, maybe we can talk back and forth. Can we get a copy of this presentation? Yes. I believe that all of our presentations will be posted on the VEM website after the conference. So you'll be able to go there. You'll be able to get that up from there and present it to your select board and start talking about issues. I love to see this as a jump start to have all of us start talking about this. Harry gave me the 2-minute warning. You killed my chat. Oh, here we go. Videos will be on YouTube page. Yeah. So you will be able to see this on YouTube. So you can watch it. You can send it to your select board, or you can just print out the presentation. So folks, with my last 30 seconds, I want to say thank you for listening in. Here we go. That is my contact information. That's my cell phone. That is my email. If after this presentation you have thoughts, you didn't get a chance to share, things come up, you're thinking about it tonight, lying awake and worried, go right ahead and ping me with something. I'd love to hear feedback on this. I really want this plan to be representative of what we expect in Vermont. And I have a duty as the planning section chief to help write good plans for all Vermonters. And the best way to do it is to hear from you as to what you actually need. So that's my time. Thank you all very much. Appreciate your attentiveness. I appreciate the comments in the chat, and I look forward to working with you all in the future.